Hi friends, in this video we are going to study an introduction to stakes and stakeholder model. We will discuss about the types of stakeholders and stakeholder engagement. Stakes and stakeholders. A stake can be defined as an interest or a share in an undertaking, while a stakeholder is an individual with a stake. A stakeholder is a party that has an interest in a company, project, etc., and can be affected or can affect the business. Stakeholders benefit from an organization, or they can be harmed or have their rights affected by an organization. Stakeholders can be beneficial, they will help you achieve your goals, and they are antagonistic when they oppose your mission. In effect, stakeholders have the power to be either a threat or a benefit to an organization. Hence, stakeholder management is a very important part of project management and one of the key knowledge areas. Further, organizations often depend on external stakeholders for resources, services, and information. Stakeholders can have claims, rights, and expectations which should not be taken lightly. They have to be honored, or there are several glaring examples where stakeholders have actually affected and stopped large projects. Thus, stakeholders must be managed carefully to avoid any negative influences on the firm's objective. Businesses must recognize their stakeholders and manage them, and vice versa. The stake can be one of the examples below or a combination. The stake can be an interest, that is, a person or a group of persons who are affected by a decision or a work, that is, like the closure of streets whenever there an event is organized. This can affect the interest of certain peoples. Rights is also a very important stake, wherein they believe to be treated in a certain way and their particular rights should be protected. That is, the occupational health and safety of the workers is their right, and the contractor must provide them necessary equipments for safety. Ownership. This is a very important stake, wherein a person or group of persons have a legal claim on an asset or property. This can be an intellectual property or a land property, wherein in case you are building a road and it passes through the land, you have to take the ownership from the person. Impact or influence. Certain stakeholders can simply influence the project, that is, government through legislation and regulations. The public can also influence if they are negatively affected by the project. The project sponsor can have a negative influence if it does not give required funds. Also, contribution matters as an important stake, that is, receipt of materials, human resources, etc., funding, and this forms as a buffer between the organization and work teams for the performance of the work. Once we have understood what stake and stakeholder are, we can now further go on to classify them into broad categories. One of the most common and widely used categorization of stakeholder is internal and external stakeholders. So internal stakeholders are those who are members of the project coalition or who provide finance. So a sponsor Project manager and his team members can be called as the core or internal stakeholder, while external stakeholders are those affected by the project in a significant way. They are customers, competitors, and suppliers. Another delineation of this can be primary and secondary stakeholders. While primary stakeholders form the group of people who continued participation is extremely important and without which the project or the organization cannot survive as a going concern. For example, the owners, employees, the vendors, whereas secondary stakeholders are those who influence or are influenced by the firm but whose presence or absence does not affect the survival of the project or the organization. For example, the media, the local community, the government, etc., are secondary stakeholders. That is another classification called as the direct and indirect stakeholders. So the stakeholders could also be contrasted between those who are contracted to provide services directly or are in a primary relationship with the organization. So people with whom you sign agreement or contracts are your direct stakeholders. For example, your employees, your consultants, contractors, and subcontractors. Indirect stakeholders are those with whom you do not have any contracted responsibility or formal redress, but are in an indirect or secondary relationship with your organization. These uncontracted or indirect stakeholders have the power to disrupt your projects through their actions, which can be sometimes political, and they cannot be easily held liable for their actions. They can be members of the community, political parties, potential users, etc. Now that we have understood the different types of stakeholders, it is essential to put them into a model to easily study them. One of the first models that was proposed was the input output stakeholder model. This considered the inputs to be suppliers, employees who are the primary stakeholders, and output to be customers to whom the project is addressed to. However, this model representation was very limited and did not show the complete nature of relationship between the stakeholders. Hence, Freeman proposed the stakeholder model in 1984. The original stakeholder model was much revised than the earlier one. It was having a more powerful visual impact. It was has a simple representation and easy for industry adoption. It shows a two-way relationship. Also, Freeman added important stakeholders like the competitors and external stakeholders like government and communities. Refinements were then made to this model in 2003. You can clearly see in the model shown that government, competitors, customers, employees, civil society, suppliers, shareholders all share a dual relationship with the organization. That is, the relation is vice versa. Both are accountable to each other. However, this did not classify the stakeholders into primary, secondary, or internal external. This modification was brought out in the 2003 adapted version of stakeholder model, wherein a box distinguished these primary, secondary, or internal and external stakeholders. So financiers, customers, communities, employees, and suppliers became the internal stakeholders, whereas NGOs, environmentalists, governments, media, critics, and other stakeholders were the external, affecting the firm directly or indirectly. Another refined stakeholder model, called the stake model, was proposed, wherein the stakeholders were further classified into stake watchers and stake keepers. So, stake watchers are stakeholders such as pressure groups who do not have a stake themselves but who protect the interest of real stakeholders. The examples are unions who fight for the workers or employees, the consumer association defending the stakes of consumer, and investor association protecting stakeholders. Whereas stake keepers is another set of people or groups who are furthermore away from being active or real stakeholder in the project, but they have the influence to control the project. They impose regulations, constraint, while the firm has a little reciprocal or direct impact on them. A very good example of stakekeeper is the government. The regulations or policies can have direct impact on the project viability, but the firm cannot make any redressal or impact on the government. Similarly, media, agencies, civil society, certification organizations, etc., form part of the stakekeepers group. Thus, the stake model of the firm shown is more elaborate and easy for industry adoption. Stakeholder engagement. Now that we have understood that stakeholder management is very important for the viability of a project, it is essential that we engage, identify these stakeholders at the very beginning of the project once the project manager is appointed. The stakeholder management involves identifying, classifying these stakeholders, thus facilitating both initial and subsequent engagement required in a timely and coordinated manner. So these project stakeholders must be engaged based on their needs, expectation, interest, and potential impact on the project. The stakeholder engagement complements stakeholder management, and both are needed for project success. The engagement will involve identifying different categories of stakeholders that we studied, gathering information about them through surveys, etc., identifying the mission in their project, that is, their expectations they have from us, determining their strengths and weaknesses, identifying what strategies they can adopt to affect us, and what strategy we can develop to manage these stakeholders. This brings us to the end of the lecture, and to summarize, we'll discuss on what a stake is, which is an interest or a share in an undertaking or a project. The project stakeholders can be defined as individuals, groups, or organizations who may affect, be effective, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision, activity, or outcome of a project. We learn to classify stakeholders into internal or external, primary or secondary, direct or indirect. Further classification and types of stakeholders will be learned in detail in the next lecture. Stakeholder model, like the Freeman's revised model, showed dual relationship and classified stakeholders into two categories. Further, the refined stakeholder model or the stakes model classified stakeholders into stake watchers and stake keepers, which was more elaborate and easy for industry adoption. Thank you.